So much talk about failure these days, not only at Creative Mornings, but also in newspapers, science magazines, entrepreneurial magazines. We're talking a lot about failure, about the power of failure, about how important it is to embrace it, about how it's like the missing ingredient in a path to success. If we ignore the failures, then we'll never really get anywhere. And we also are talking a lot these days about the voice inside our heads that tells us we suck all the time. I call that voice the ugly voice, because I don't like mincing words. That's totally what it is. It lies and it shouts to you all the time about how you're not good enough, you're not doing it right, nobody will care. Some people call it the inner critic, but I like ugly voice because it just calls it like it is. And I'm not going to talk about that today. I was like, what can I talk about that's not about that? And I was thinking about this and thinking about this over quite a long time. And I decided that what I'd like to do is think about the stories that we tell ourselves about failure. Not the inner critic, not the one that's there all the time and is usually a big fat liar, but the stories we deliberately tell ourselves, consciously, the part of our inner monologue that we choose. Because I don't think we've really been talking about that a lot. And I have noticed, once I started thinking about this, that I do this a lot. I create stories about my life. And you probably do too, whether you notice it or not. So my goal today is to have you think about the stories you tell yourself. And I, in thinking about the many, many stories I've told myself about failure over the course of my life, it's the very first one that I decided to focus on today because it has the longest trajectory, but also it really stuck with me, and I get to show you this picture. This story starts when I was 7 years old. When I was 7 years old, I was in grade 2, and I have this very vivid memory of standing on my desk. Actually, I don't even think it was my desk. It was a desk in the back of my grade 2 classroom, and I was standing on the desk. But my memory of that day was not the exhilaration that comes from being allowed to stand on a desk, but the fact that I was standing on a desk in order to reach the top of a cardboard robot that I was making. Now, my memory doesn't serve. I have no idea why I was making a cardboard robot. I assume that it had something to do with the class project. I'm pretty sure there were other kids in the classroom also making a cardboard robot. But I was standing on this desk to reach the heights of the robot that I had concocted probably over days or weeks at that point. And I was devastated because no matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, no matter how big I made it, that cardboard robot did not look like what I wanted it to look like. It just wasn't what I wanted, and I felt quite defeated. I didn't feel the exhilaration of standing on my desk. I didn't feel liberated. I didn't feel, right, at 7, you're not like, wow, this is the coolest thing in the world. Never again in my life will I be asked by my teacher to stand on a desk, right? Instead, I started telling myself a story, and it's a story I told myself my whole life. I was a girl who cannot make what I see in my mind. That's what I felt. I felt, I can have this elaborate vision, I have a really great imagination, but when it comes to actually making something from that imagination, when it comes to saying, what an amazing assignment, we're gonna make robots in 2nd grade, what I felt was defeat. I am not a girl who can make what I see in my mind. This story affected kind of the whole trajectory of my life, really. When I was in high school, I didn't take art class. Why would a girl who can't make what she sees in her mind take art class? I didn't really enjoy art class. Also, I think I had had a couple of art teachers who kept telling me I was doing it wrong, instead of saying, "Oh, good for you! How fascinating!" Right? So instead of that, I'm not going to take the full weight of my 7-year-old decision to tell this story. But at the same time, I really very deliberately lived as the protagonist in the story I created. I really very deliberately behaved as the girl who could not make what I saw in my mind. And so I took drafting classes, and I took shop class, and I did the other things, but I didn't see myself as creative. I just simply couldn't translate that vivid imagination into something tangible. And I didn't really beat myself up about it because there was so much more to do. And I was a good student. I didn't feel like a failure, but this was something that really, this story affected every decision that I made, kind of all over the place. And we'll see where that's going. Clearly, I'm going somewhere with that. Now, eventually, flash forward to my early 20s. In my early 20s, I was an utter disaster. I don't know if anyone here is in your early 20s, but I feel you, man. If you're like faking it, if you're like putting on your pretty face and like just showing it to the world and just waiting until the faking it makes it, I am with you. My early 20s, I was just, it was a hard, horrible time. I was in grad school at the time. It was the worst decision I ever could have made for my career. I just didn't want to move home to my parents' house after college. Don't go to grad school if that's your reason. And I just felt this void all the time. I felt like I needed a hobby. And it's interesting that I felt like I needed a hobby because I had never had one before. Because the girl who can't make what she sees in her mind isn't particularly crafty, right? That girl doesn't say, ooh, I want that pretty turquoise necklace, and then go make it, because since I couldn't make it, I just went and bought it. And so here I was at like age 22, like pacing, and I just felt enveloped by this awful void. And it was not anything I had ever felt before. And suddenly, like, this protagonist of my story was in peril. And I just didn't know what to do. And at the time, I had just started dating someone. And this guy that I started dating, he's here. Spoiler alert, we got married. He was a guy who could make what he saw in his mind. He was a guy, one day he was like, I want to make a desk. And I was like, what? He was like, no, seriously, like, I'm going to make a desk. And I was like, people don't do that. Like, normal people don't, I don't understand. And then he made a desk, and it was like it worked. It was like a desk, and I was like, this is very strange. And especially, right, the girl who can't make what she sees in her mind. This was kind of mind-blowing. But I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know how to go out and get a hobby. I had always really enjoyed spending time with people like Greg, who can make what they see in their minds. I loved spending time with musicians and poets and artists. I didn't really feel comfortable around them because I felt I had nothing to contribute, because I couldn't really relate, but I was in awe. And that just made me very uncomfortable kind of all the time. Again, right, early 20s, I totally feel you. And so I went to the big box store, craft store one day. I was like, you've just got to do something about this. You have to fill this, you've got to do anything. Do not leave this craft store without something to make. And I paced the aisles, and I paced the aisles, and eventually I saw this little box, and it said, make mosaic coasters. And I said, mosaics? That's gluing. That's not drawing. That's not painting. That's not sketching. That's not even really like sculpting. I can do this. I'm going to follow instructions, and then I'll have handy coasters. And this will be very practical, and I'll know how to grout, so I'll grow as a person, and this will be great. And I took the kit home, and I said, hey, new guy I'm dating who seems to be able to do anything, would you like to make coasters with me? And he said yes. And we made these coasters, and lo and behold, they could hold a mug. And I said, perhaps I have finally found it. Is that a bit of sunlight shining through onto the protagonist of my story? Is this near the end? This is wonderful. So we went to Home Depot, and we went to the bathroom tile aisle at Home Depot, and we bought tiles and a tile scorer and some plywood to use like as a canvas. And he got this big piece of tile, and he sketched things out. And as he was making his mosaic, and I was barely paying attention because I was hunched over like a bridge table in our tiny apartment, or it was actually a big apartment, we'll forget about that right now. And I was like sketching and trying to make this elaborate design because I could finally do it, because I was gluing and not really, having to create what I saw in my mind. I realized, of course, that I was a girl who can't create what I see in my mind. And in the time that it took me to glue a few tiles and fret about how they didn't look like I wanted them to look, Greg had made a 3-by-4-foot desert landscape. And I was like, okay, let's hang that in our bedroom, because that's beautiful, and I'm going to clearly need to go find another hobby. I have used the grouting skill since then, so I did get a good skill, but I just really didn't know what to do with myself. Sorry, that was an old slide. There was a picture of mosaic there. Let's forget that slide even existed. This slide, spoiler alert, eventually I found a hobby. In my mid-20s, when I stopped feeling entirely like I was never going to be able to make it in the world as a functioning adult, I learned how to knit, and I learned how to crochet. These hobbies stuck with me. I loved them because I got to make what someone else saw in their mind. It was great. There were instructions, and I could take my leeway with them. I was what I didn't know at the time was considered to be like a fearless knitter or a fearless crocheter. I didn't feel I needed to follow a pattern to the letter, but I did need somewhere to start. I needed to say, oh, I want that sweater. I might make it a little longer, and I'm going to take it in the arms, and I'm going to do it in a different color, but I'm going to follow this other person's instructions. And I ended up working in the knitting and crochet field, which is a story for a different time. But it turned out that I was really comfortable writing, and I started writing about knitting and crochet. I started a website. This was back in 2004, like the dawn of the popular blog age. And So I was happy. I had filled that void. It was amazing. I met people who loved knitting and crochet. I met people who designed knitting and crochet patterns. They were the people whose visions I was kind of banking on. It was amazing, and I got to work with them. I got to collaborate with them. I got to be an editor for their designs, and I loved that kind of thing. The story didn't change, though. I insisted through all of that time that I wasn't creative. I was a girl who couldn't make what I saw in my mind. I just liked celebrating and helping and enhancing what other people saw in their minds. Eventually, I did start riffing off on my own things. I had kind of developed these skills, and I started making dolls. Not dolls that look like humans, because they really do make me really uncomfortable, but dolls that looked kind of odd. Dolls that maybe didn't have arms or legs because I found them tedious to make, and they were my creations, and who cares if they didn't have arms or legs. And I started making all these kind of quirky things, and people liked them, and I was like, okay. And the cracks in that veneer of not being creative sort of started to widen a little bit, because I felt that I was able to kind of make things that even sometimes were a little bit gruesome in a world that was filled with cute and pretty. And I was like, that was the seeds of where I ended up going with my career, as Rachael alluded to earlier. But one day I was asked by a colleague of mine to design a doll for a book she was writing. And I was like, this is amazing. I'm thinking zombie cheerleaders. And she was like, well, my editor really wants a teddy bear. And I was like, okay. Well, I really want to support your book. I'm going to make you a teddy bear. And they sent me the yarn, and I made the arms and the legs and all the tedious parts, and I assembled them together. And when it came to the face, there was nothing about this face that looked like a bear. I was the girl who couldn't make what I saw in my mind. I was like, sitting on the couch in my living room going like, I'm pulling my hair out. I can't even tell you the words that were coming out of my mouth. It was a horrible experience. And my friend came into the living room, and he's like, what are you doing? And I said, oh my God, I'm pulling my hair out. I can't make this stupid thing look like a teddy bear. And he was like, well, what if you move the snout down a little bit? So I named the bear after him, because as far as I'm concerned, there would be no bear without my friend Scott. So that's Scott, the bear, and it went into this book, and it was simply reinforcement to me that I was the girl who can't make what I see in my mind. I was going to stick to my ridiculous, kind of odd, bit of sort of gruesome dolls. Around this time, my friend threw himself a 30th birthday party. Thank God, the end of our 20s. Right? He threw himself a 30th birthday party, and it was a crafty party. He filled his apartment with craft supplies. Fabric scraps, he had a couple of sewing machines going. I think there were like treats and cupcakes and stuff, and I was like, all right, I now identify as a capital C crafter. I make stuff, and I work in the crafts industry. This is my kind of party. And I showed up at the party, and I realized right away that I hadn't sewn successfully in my entire adult life. This was not something that I actually knew how to do. And then my elation turned very quickly into, dear God, they're going to find out that I'm a big fat liar, that I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm not actually crafty at all. I'm the girl who can't make what I see in my mind. I have no useful skills in this arena. This is terrible. And I sat down with my drink in the corner of this party, and I felt like I had when I was younger, and I had surrounded myself sort of with artists that I felt I was really not worthy of, and I just didn't know what to do with myself until I turned my head, and in a pile of fabric scraps, I found this really ugly fabric. I mean, it was awful. It was awful. Like, it was in the scrap heap, surely, because nobody ever bought it for real in the store. And I wanted to make a doll, because I'd really become comfortable making these creatures, and they had personalities, and this really kind of fed my imagination, but I didn't know how to sew a doll. I only kind of knew kind of the kind of idea of it, right? You cut out the two pieces of fabric, they should be vaguely the same shape, you sew them up, you stuff it, that whole thing, but people would find out that I didn't know what I was doing. And so I really struggled with that for a while until I decided, you know what? You like the fabric because it's ugly. Just make a really ugly doll. Don't worry about making it cute ugly. Don't give it, all the little details that you usually do so that other people don't recoil. Make it as ugly as you possibly can, because that's why you love this fabric anyway. And then the whole rest of the party disappeared. I don't remember anything that went on that night. I created with abandon for the first time probably since I started the cardboard robot when I was 7. It was amazing. And when I was done, sorry, skip that slide. That's what I had. I named her Shoshana because all of my dolls had a name. Her name was Shoshana, and she really needed accessories, so I crocheted her a scarf because she thinks she's beautiful and she believes that adornment is important. And people around me were like, oh, how nice for you. Okay. And I was like, this is it. And then I started talking to all of my other crafty friends and going why don't we ever make things that are ugly? Why do we feel so much pressure? Why do we accept the pressure that everything has to be perfect and beautiful and pretty and cute all the time? Aren't you feeling so oppressed by this? And they were like, I hadn't actually ever really thought of it. And I was like, well, I can't stop thinking about it. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Until one day, a couple of years later, that's how much I thought about it. That's because the girl who can't make what she sees in her mind doesn't make the stuff, she just thinks about it. And one day I was coming home on the number 7 bus, and I had this, duh, everybody needs to make something ugly. At least once. Every single person in the entire world just simply needs to do this at least once. Obviously. And I ran home and I registered a domain name, right? mightyugly.com. I was like, mighty, this is great. We're gonna embrace failures. We're gonna do all of that kind of stuff. We are just gonna experience the abandon or the terror that can come from making something intentionally ugly. And I invited some friends over because you have to test the concept out. So I invited some crafty friends over. I didn't tell them why. And in my living room when they showed up was a table filled with fabric scraps and yarn scraps and all this kind of stuff and a glue gun. And about a dozen people sat around and I said, okay, make something ugly. There was crickets in the room. And I was like, okay, it has to be a creature. You don't just have to make anything ugly. A creature, because that's important to have a constraint. I said it has to be a creature and it has to be ugly. And eventually they were like, yeah, all right, I guess we came all this way. We might as well just make something ugly. And in the end of the evening, we went round robin, and talked about and introduced, kind of show and tell style, the creatures that we had made. And I'm going to show you a bit of a video here of my friend Miranda, who's also here today, whose story stuck with me so much, it's what made the girl who can't make what she sees in her mind stick with this idea.
When I was in grade 1, we were making dioramas, and we had pine cones and moss and everything. We went to a park and got all this stuff. And I had it was over a couple days, and I tried to glue down this pine cone using glue, and it wasn't staying because there just wasn't enough of surface area with the white glue. It wasn't working. So then what I decided in my grade 1 world, I was like, okay, well, you know what, maybe if I put a band of glue over top of the pine cone and really carefully so that it'll actually stay connected and let it dry, maybe it'll hold on this pine cone. And it actually worked. And so this is a tribute to that. So this has been glued on using glue over top of the device as a band. And the very next time, basically after we finished all these projects, the teacher stood in front of the class and held up my diorama as an example of how not to use glue.
Fail.
So? Yes. So this is FU, this is O.
Right? So I was like, okay, clearly I'm onto something here. And so this is what I've been doing for the last several years. I do workshops where people come in, and I especially love it when people who are not creative come in. People who are like, no, I don't know. I'm like, really? Because I'm the girl who can't make what I see in my mind. Come sit down. You're going to make something ugly. It's going to be great. If you fail, you got something pretty. Right? So, not so bad. Not so bad. So I had found my mission. This is what I was going to do. I was going to make ugly things with people. And it's amazing the kinds of conversations I would have with people about making ugly things. Like the guy who had a buttonphobia once, this is not his creature, but he sat for an hour and made the tiniest little creature that I thought was adorable out of buttons, and he was like, I have a buttonphobia, honest to God. And it was so uncomfortable, and I could see the sweat on his face, but I could also see the satisfaction that he felt from just addressing it and doing it. It was like it gave him that avenue. Now, I still make ugly things all the time. I make them when I'm feeling blocked, because usually I'm feeling blocked because I'm fearing failing, or I'm just, uncomfortable about something or else or other, and I was like, I'm just gonna throw one under the bus. I'm gonna throw it under the bus, and then everything goes up from there. Everything goes up from there. One day last winter, so now we're talking 30 years from the birth of the girl who cannot make what she sees in her mind. I was 37 in the fall of this past year, and my son, who was 3 at the time, said to me, Mama, we were painting. We had out the watercolor paints and newspaper on the dining room table. He said, Mama, make a whale with a polka dot tail. And I was about to say, oh, honey, I don't paint. I can't. That's I don't do that. And instead, I was like, am I going to be that mom? Am I going to do that? Am I going to not be the mighty ugly person? Am I going to be the girl who can't make what she sees in her mind? And it was a really big moment for me. And I made a whale, damn it. No! I can't do slides. But I did make a whale, and it's vaguely a whale. And my kid loved that whale, and it still hangs in his room. And that was a big lesson for me, right? It was a lesson I could talk about. It was a lesson I could, but it was a lesson I really needed to live. And that really kind of set me on my way. At the same time, throughout 2013, my friend Miriam, who's a knitwear designer, had been posting a photo every day on Instagram and Facebook, and she was tagging them year of making. Every day, she was keeping track of what she made. And she made things all the time. And she wasn't taking gorgeous photos. This was not a photography project. This was a documentation project of just keeping track of what she made every day and making sure she made something every day. And on January 1st of 2014, I was like, I was making cookies. I was like, this seems like an okay thing, but I'm gonna set some parameters for myself, and the parameters are nothing. That was it. I was like, I had tried doing like a self-portrait a day. I had tried keeping a list a day. I had tried doing all of these things and inevitably never stuck with it. And then of course, there's another story I told myself about failure. I had no discipline. I was going to whatever. So here I was like, I'm going to make these cookies today, and every day in 2014, I'm going to make something, whether it's dinner or mending a shirt where a button fell off, or a masterpiece of God knows what. And that's what I did, and I realized I actually make stuff a lot. I had become a crafty person. I was somebody who did sew a button in a day, or occasionally make dinner, even though I hate cooking. And by March, this project took a turn that I didn't expect, and I didn't even notice it when it happened. And instead of just documenting what I made every day, it became this excuse to try everything. Everything. I've got watercolor paints at home now that are not the ones that my kid uses. I have pens at home. I keep a sketchbook. The girl who cannot make what she sees in her mind keeps a sketchbook. I make candles and I do doodles, and it's become something that I've always wanted but never allowed myself. The girl who can't make what she sees in her mind doesn't take a sketchbook when she travels and doodle according to the skyline that's out her window, but then suddenly that's what I was doing. And suddenly it just didn't matter anymore that I was a girl who couldn't make what she saw in her mind. And this picture right here, though she might blanch that I'm showing it in public, Rachael, who introduced me today, she's an artist. She's a cut paper artist. And she makes amazing work. She makes amazing work. And one day she said to me, hey, we're gonna get together tonight. You wanna collaborate on something? I keep going back because I don't want that last slide to show yet. It wasn't supposed to advance automatically. I'm just gonna go back. We can look at those again. And instead, I was really surprised by myself. That's the kind of thing I would always make an excuse not to do, because you'll find out that I'm going to really make what you, like, you're gonna not want to be associated with the stuff that I make. I can't make what I see in my mind. This is a terrible thing. And what I do make, it's ugly unintentionally, right? And instead I was like, yeah! And we got together, and I had like gel pens and magazine cutouts, and she had her X-Acto knife, and together we made, I'll try to advance back. Oh, it's totally not working now, I broke the slides. Okay, well, that last picture that you can maybe remember was, we just passed it back and forth, and I felt no intimidation about this at all, and we giggled so much. We giggled so much, and one of the things that I've learned from Rachael, one of the reasons I loved her talk so much, is that she really believes that play is so important, and I had never let myself play. The girl who can't make what she sees in her mind doesn't make stuff. Why would she? And I had suddenly realized that I became a girl who makes what I see in my mind. Now that slide I was trying to hide from you is actually the punchline. Oh, Mo. How fascinating. Right? And suddenly I realized that I was a girl who used to not be able to make what I saw in my mind. And I didn't get any particular talent or any particular inclination or skill that I never had before. I just stopped telling myself that I couldn't make what I saw in my mind. I stopped caring. And now I just make stuff all the time. I make all sorts of other kinds of things. And so my question for you today is not think about what your inner critic tells you, what that ugly voice tells you that you're terrible at. But what story do you tell yourself? What stories do you tell yourself? In what stories are you the protagonist? And how can you save that protagonist from the story? Thanks so much for having me, and thanks, Opus. Thanks, Mark.
Let's ask our speakers some tough questions and engage in some dialogue. Who wants to kick us off? And you could ask a crappy question. You could totally just fail.
It's fascinating.
Totally, this is a crappy question. During your year of making, it was really interesting that some of the things that you counted as making are really prosaic things. I made dinner. creativity, the nature of the concept is broad and airy and fluffy and far-reaching, and we can't even see where the vectors go, right? And yet we define it so narrowly, like she made dinner. Who cares, right? That's not creative. How do you think it is that we manage to take this concept that is so infinite and constrain it to the point where we tell the kinds of stories about ourselves that you told about yourself?
Oh, my brain just broke. I think you just asked the question that I spend every day thinking about answering, but you articulated it way better than I ever articulate it. I don't know how we got there. That I can't answer, but I think that we have a tendency to try sometimes when we're feeling even remotely insecure to exclude ourselves from the things that we respect. I think that, right, the girl who couldn't make what she saw in her mind excluded herself from the club of anybody who makes anything that they see in their mind, whether it's a souffle or, a grand masterpiece. And I think that that's a really dramatic telling of that particular story, but that at any moment, right? So I think all of us, no matter what it is that we consider ourselves to be makers of, we have all had that moment, and some of us many times in a day, where we push our chair back and we say, why did I ever get into this? Clearly I'm not meant for this. Other people can do this and I can't do it, right? And I think it's at those moments that we elevate something that we're struggling with to be something that's beyond our grasp. And so maybe this comes from our inherent great job that we do at being unfair to ourselves. Maybe it's that we accept, maybe it's that we accept some elitism that we see in the world as being real when it's a construct itself. Right, so I get to sit around now, and I'm not intimidated so much talking to really wildly amazing makers and artists anymore. But then they get to me and they're like, "So what do you make?" And I'm like, "Oh, ugly things." And they're like, "Oh," and the world doesn't end then. The elitist shell that we've built around ourselves doesn't crack and the whole world falls out. They're just like, "Huh," and some people are like, well, and that's fine. Let them go. But I think that your question speaks to what I try very hard to believe is what most of us think, which is, how did we get here? How can we not be here anymore? How can we just make it so that we're cool, so that we can have those struggles? It doesn't mean we stop struggling. It just means that we stop giving up. And to a great extent, it means we stop giving up before we start, right? That's what I did. I gave up when I was 7, a whole host of things that may have made me utterly miserable, but they may have really made me feel happy and fulfilled. And that's a really long-winded, sort of convoluted question to a really answer to a really well-stated question. But I'm going to answer with, let's all be more fair and kind to ourselves. We all belong.
Hi.
Hi.
So as you sort of become more successful with your book and with your exercises that you do with people and things like that, do you feel like there's also the resistance grows, that also the fear grows? Or how do you, as you become more successful with the idea of making things ugly, do you find that there's something that you also have to be able to make yourself fail at, allow yourself to fail? Do you have to be more careful with that or more open with that? Or do you find that that's a harder struggle now as it's becoming more of a thing?
No, and I think that's why I'm kind of weird. That's a great question, and no, I haven't struggled with that. Something I put my finger on a few years ago when I started this, and I started talking to people about this, and when I was writing my book and I sent people interview questions, tell me a time that you really tanked, and especially tell me about a time that you thought you were gonna nail it and you really tanked. I was like, I'm really comfortable talking about things a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about. And I think that comfort with that makes me, I can never stop being comfortable talking about what's uncomfortable, if that makes any sense. No, I've actually gotten more comfortable. I've gotten more comfortable. And I think the reason I got more comfortable is not because I've met any success, just that I've started letting myself just be me, right? I've stopped, right? That kid who couldn't make what she saw in her mind was a story I told myself, and however that was actually reflected in skills I did or didn't have, it was still a story, and then I stopped telling it to myself, and then I started walking more comfortably in my skin. And so, no, I mean, I still don't want to fail. I still avoid it. I'm like, oh my God, for the love of God, please people buy my books. You know, that kind of a thing where it's like, ooh, and I feel those nerves, but I don't think I feel them. I think I actually feel them more comfortably. I'm able to look at them and say, wow, I'm really struggling with this. Hey, I can put words to that. I can say, wow, I'm struggling with this, and that's cool. I'll get through it some way. Either at the end of it we'll be like, big tank, or we'll be like, woo, or maybe something in the middle. And wow, I'm like nervous answering that question, but.
I really love the distinction that you made between the story you used to tell yourself and the story you tell yourself now. And I'm wondering if you can offer one simple way that we can all practice living into this new story.
Well, I think the key is identifying what the story is. I think that, right, so failure and insecurity, self-doubt, perfectionism, those are things we try to pretend a lot of the time don't exist. We just, oh, there's that nagging voice, right? There's that voice, and I'm just gonna focus over here and keep that over there. But I am a big fan of looking in the dark corner and identifying what is that ugly voice that's telling you the big fat lies, and what is your voice. And I think once you identify that, and that's not easy. That's not like, oh, I'm gonna go home tonight, make some tea, you know, put on some CBC and really introspect a little. But I think that I think that the key to changing any story is knowing what the story is. And sometimes it's not a story that needs to change. I mean, it's still important to me that I was a girl who couldn't make what I saw in my mind. That 7-year-old picture up there is never gonna stop being me. It's just that story is no longer a driving story in my life, and I could only give it or take away its power by knowing what it was. And so that's my tip, is to do the hard part. You know, really look inside and see, like, how have I been really, really tanking myself lately? And it's hard to do, right? Because you have to like accept responsibility for what that is. And so I don't say that lightly, but I think that's the key.
We are approaching the end here, we're running out of time. Is there, somebody have maybe one or two? You guys okay with a few more minutes? Okay. Yeah, I know.
This is just a brief question I'll fail at. Do you find your personality has changed, or your relationships has changed, or your spirit, has it changed since all this?
It's such a good question. My husband might be able to answer that question a little bit. My personality, no. My comfort level, yeah. My therapist might be able to answer that even better. No, I mean, I've always been a bit nutty, and I'm from New York originally. I've always been a bit louder than people here, talk a little faster. But I have definitely socially felt far less anxiety once I was like, yeah, this is, right? I think when I realized what the voices in my head were saying and who was saying them and why, then they stopped making me so concerned about what all the other people around me were sort of saying. And so, like at parties, I'm not quite as inclined to be a wallflower anymore. That's a really hard question. But so yes and no. I'm going to say, right, like fundamentally me, always me, now with a tiny bit less nuts.
I don't know about
Just
that.
a tiny bit less.
Thank you. Do you feel that we partly have a language problem in that we assign the category of failure to things that maybe shouldn't have the category of failure? Like we're being really strict in defining what failure can become. Like, a bridge that fails and kills 1,000 people, that's failure. Burning, toast, not so much. So how do we escape from that, language barrier of calling things that shouldn't be failures in ourselves?
That's a great question, and I think you're right. And I like to think of failure as the stopping of doing whatever it is. It's either the bridge that stops carrying people across it, or it's ourselves, right? It's failure is the end of the line. It's not a step along the way, and that is hard to kind of talk about. I actually think about, this is gonna, not to be too, I think about death a lot. And I think about how I don't die most of the time, yet, when I fail. I think about the fact that like making dinner for my family might result in a frenzied preparation of peanut butter sandwiches, but probably not anybody dying. And I think about how, you know, I'll get halfway into a sweater I'm making, hate it, rip it out, curse myself, also not dead. And that's dramatic. That's dramatic, and I tend to be a bit melodramatic, I get that. I'm also really comfortable thinking about things like death, and most people aren't, so again, weird. But I think that's part of how we can do it. Like, we need to simply accept that there is no positive without a negative. There is no happiness when it's not contrasted against whatever, against angst or sadness or pain. And it's not that we should seek out the angst and the sadness and pain, we just have to know that it's a part of our lives. And if we fight it and fight it and fight it so hard, it just becomes that much more of us not enjoying the good stuff. And so I try really hard to enjoy the good stuff and to know that the bad stuff will come and eventually it'll end. I'm getting all zen on you now, but like that's, right? There's a great book. I'm gonna, this is like the last question I think Mark said. Read a book called The Antidote by a guy named Oliver Burkeman. It's an outstanding book. It's called Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, but it's a beautiful book about, you know, shit happens. And let's stop trying to pretend it doesn't. Let's start trying to prevent it from happening, but let's.
One more.
No. Oh, there's one more. I swore at the very, I thought I was done.
I always feel this, I have mild sort of OCD tendencies anyway, and I like my world ordered. And whenever I do this, if I don't feel like the questions are distributed evenly through the room, I get very upset. I'm like, this corner, there's something wrong with this corner. Thank you for correcting my world.
Do you feel that addressing the story that you're telling yourself and kind of working through that, has that affected the inner critic? Like, is that either diminished now or you can deal with it better, or what's the relationship there?
Yeah. I think that identifying the stories that I tell myself went hand in hand with identifying what that schmuck says. And when I started attributing those voices to myself versus that other guy, it really helped me appreciate the lying lies versus the kind of the truths, right? Like, so yes, I think that it came with that same kind of honesty that I was talking about, looking inside and seeing where all of this stuff is coming from, and knowing that some of it, like that voice is always there, right? Another book, read Creative Block by Danielle Krissa. She has 50 artists address this, and it's beautiful, right? What does your inner critic say? I call it the ugly voice because I like to be melodramatic. But, you know, everybody has it. The most successful people in the world that we revere and think we could never be worthy of, they all suffer these same things. And so it's not that it ever goes away. It's just that we can choose not to pay attention to that guy so much anymore, and not to give up when it says that we should. And then we need to listen to our own stories too, right? It was way easier for me to change the story I told myself. That was something I had complete control over. And so that changing of present tense to past tense in that story, that was cool. That, like, as soon as I noticed it, I was like, huh, doesn't quite seem right, you know? And then, but that other guy will always be there. I personified him. He's green, he's tiny, has like a hair. And that helped, actually, right? Like, because I know me, my own inner monologue is, you know, me. Maybe she looks 7. But that other guy, I had to like put a face on him so I could be like, shut up. I'm choosing to ignore you. And that happens, you know, on a daily basis, but related for sure.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
It's great to be here.